So hi, I'm Reed Halpern. I'm currently a professor at Concordia University, but I'm soon going to be joining you at TU Dresden. So I'm really excited about that. And it's my incredible pleasure today to introduce Matteo Pasquinelli, who's been an inspiration to me actually for like a decade. I don't know how long I've known you, but Matteo is a remarkable scholar who's really done an immense amount to really bring the political and ethical stakes of philosophy, and particularly of how we theorize and understand artificial intelligence and digital media more generally into the present. So I think he's done a remarkable amount of work in rethinking our methods, but more importantly, making philosophy matter really into how we're thinking about designing, constructing, and imagining the future of our technologies. He has a prodigious publishing career that's so long, I can't even begin, but I'll just give you a little bit of his bio. Matteo is currently a professor in media philosophy at the University of Arts and Design at Karlsruhe, where he is coordinating the research group on artificial intelligence and media philosophy. Kim. He edited the anthology Allies of the Mind, Augmented Intelligence and Its Traumas, which you all should check out, and is a really innovative rethinking of the relationship between our mind and machine. And with Lada and Yoler, he's also done the visual essay, The New Scope Manifested AI as Instrument of Knowledge Extractivism, which you can check out online at newscope.ai. His research focuses the intersection of cognitive sciences, digital economy, and machine intelligence. And for VersaVox, he's currently preparing a monograph on the history of AI titled The Eye of the Master. We're all breathtakingly waiting to read. So today, without further ado, he's going to be speaking about what kind of knowledge model is machine learning for political epistemology of AI. And I give the floor to you, Matteo.
Thanks, Reed, for the presentation, and thanks also to Richard, Jonas, all the organizers of this event. It's a big responsibility for me to conclude this conference. There are so many deep, profound, inspiring, and complex contribution. But nevertheless, I'm very happy also to see you, at least virtually, and to congratulate you for this position that apparently officially you will finally in Dresden. So happy to have you back in Germany, and maybe looking forward to some collaboration. Now, let's take this keynote as a kind of attempt to establish a discourse, a collective research agenda on the topic of AI. And I'm finding my, I'm looking for my mouse to start the slideshow. I hope you see perfectly this, right? Urit, is everything fine?
Yes, it looks great.
Fantastic. Okay, yeah, as I said, there's a big responsibility for me. My contribution is about, indeed, asking, I would say, collectively, what kind of knowledge model is machine learning representing today? And I'm stressing the idea of knowledge model rather than knowledge, because with you, I want also to discuss the fact that the knowledge that is represented by machine learning, current form of AI, is not a correct direct representation of the world outside, but is a form of modeling of this world. The subtitle is a bit ambitious. It's a political epistemology of AI. AI is already a complex field. Epistemology in itself is another complex field of philosophy. Naming something political epistemology of AI sounds pretentious, but it's just, probably we can explain this in few words, it's just my attempt to recognize what are the external sources of the intelligence we encode in artificial intelligence. It's a way to recognize indeed the role, the contribution of society, labor, collective behavior in the construction of this complex machine. It's difficult to describe what is AI. I propose with you to sketch a sort of modest scaffolding, what I define here, an epistemic scaffolding of artificial intelligence. I think when we discuss AI is a technical form, we encounter the same problem we encounter when we discuss any other technological artifact. So I think that we should start to distinguish in AI, as usually we do in the history of science and technology, for instance, that are present different level. And here I just mention few. You can add more. This is not indeed the attempt to produce an ontology, but is indeed probably just a sketch of a topology of what is AI today. I think when we discuss AI, we can distinguish an ideological form, a logical form, a technical form, and a social form. And I insist on this notion or word form rather than talking about ideology, logics, techniques, and society, because I want to stress with you the fact that a sort of influence, a kind of formation, a sort of influence of form start from society, from economic and social forces that are transmitted to the technology, and then technical form influence logical form, and vice versa. Then this can backward influence back the technical and the social form. This is just an attempt, but let's have a look at which specific forms of all these different forms we have in machine learning. When we talk about the ideology of AI, the ideological form of AI, we can mention, of course, the myth of thinking automata and something that belongs to the history of mythology and collective imagery. When we look at the logical form of today machine learning, I think we have to be a bit precise here. And I think during this conference, this has emerged quite clearly. The logical form of today machine learning is mostly this automation of statistical tool for multidimensional analysis that belong to the history of statistical thinking until since the early 20th century. The technical form of machine learning, on the other hand, is pretty chaotic. It's like a conurbation of different experiments in which you find, the most diverse algorithm and topology of neural network. And we have to think that indeed the history of AI has been, in the last 50 years, a history of chaotic experiment, from artificial neural networks to support vector machine to Bayesian networks and so on. This is a more, I would say, chaotic layer of the current composition of AI that we will see in a second. But last but not least, I think that what is the most important aspect that we have to stress is that artificial intelligence as a technology of automation is directly related to social forces, is directly related to drives to automate labor under different forms, the automation of manual, mental, and visual labor that took different forms in the last century. AI is directly related to drives to control social behavior and to new technique of data governance. Okay, this is just my sketch to understand which forms of knowledge are operating within machine learning today. And also as an attempt to map, I would say, the different disciplines that are mobilized today to discuss AI or to develop the new field of critical AI studies. And you can take, I think, your favorite paradigm here and locate it within this scaffolding. For instance, you can take paradigms, schools of theory like German media theory or science and technology study, or the Kulturtechnikforschung, schools of intuitionist mathematics, and you will see how they actually operate at different level of this epistemic scaffolding, stressing in some cases the autonomy of some form, in other cases stressing the communication, the circulation of ideas through all this different level. Just to take an example, when we think of German media theory, our thought goes directly to, paradigm of techno-determinism that stress the autonomy of the technological layer against other layers, for instance. Or, other example of, actually, they can be brought to stress, as I said, circulation of ideas through this form. I just want to mention, in fact, that what I'm trying to pursue as a research agenda in this period is to address AI from the point of view of historical epistemology. And historical epistemology is a specific school of research that emerged within the history of science and technology. I think of it is pretty familiar with historical epistemology because it's been the methodology that's been developed, for instance, the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin since the 90s. And has been indeed, in my opinion, an attempt to keep all this level together. If somebody is interested in a sort of summary of this approach, I would recommend this book by Pietro Daniel Amodeo, titled Political Epistemology, that I want to mention because it was also one of the inspiration for the title of this talk. And with you, I would like to go now through this, the different layers of this scaffolding, but not spending too much time on, for instance, the level of ideology. I'm more interested in studying and looking at the conurbation and imbrication of the logical, the technical, and the social form. But I want to say something specifically on what is an important component of today's discourse of AI, that is the ideological component. Today, I would say a good part of the business of AI, I would say even the 90% of the business of AI today is about the construction of an ideological artifice. We are clearly seeing processes of anthropomorphism and naturalization of a technical artifact that look completely different from what the image of AI is received by the people. And here we have to consider, however, that ideology in all its aspects is one of the knowledge model that we have to keep in mind, and it's quite operative. But I just want to, with you, consider the fact of this incredible friction in between mythologies of intelligence that we have today and the mathematical construct that we have on the other side within machine learning and its studies. For me, it's important when discussing the knowledge model and the epistemology of AI, because there is clearly a sort of colonization of notion like intelligence, learning, and creativity by AI corporation. There is a process of mystification that is under the eye of everyone. But more importantly for me, what we have in this general discourse on the almighty capacity of AI is the denial of the epistemological question. What do I mean by this? I think that indeed the ideology of AI is often based on something unique in the history of human civilization. Because usually in the history of human civilization, tools have always emerged together with a system of knowledge associated to them. But this seems pretty confusing, an artifact that for the first time equate machine and intelligence. This distinction between knowledge and tool, of course, exists also in machine learning, as a distinction, for example, between programming languages and application, or any computational theory of programming and the final application. But it seems indeed remove in a debate that is fixated with the equation, with an equation that is unique in the history of epistemology. So the fact that a machine embodies directly intelligence. This denial of the epistemological question and this role of of a sort of indeed ideology, it's something indeed that I want to discuss in depth. Has been already covered by many important authors. Of course, as a bad example of this tendency to idealize AI, to transport animistic myth towards AI, we take usually Ray Kurzweil and his idea of singularity, but also, works like the one of Nick Bostrom and his book Superintelligence, in my opinion, should be taken in should be considered as part of the speculative genre. But more recently, I would say, finally, new scholars started to address this ideological level. And I would recommend really, for instance, this book by Yard and Katz, Artificial Whiteness. And what is also my favorite, it is Surrogate Humanity by Neda Atanasovsky and Kalin Dvora, that I think is an incredible, useful book to address the politics that is mobilized in the ideology of artificial intelligence today. And Neda Atanasovsky and Kalin Dvora, they clarify very well in this book how the dreams of full automation of AI has never been neutral, but also often historically grounded on the surrogate humanity of slaves, servants, workers, and women that have made possible through their invisible labor the universalistic ideal of a free and autonomous subject. These are indeed important contribution to this critique of the ideology of artificial intelligence. And last but not least, we can also mention Sublime Dreams of Living Machine by Min-Soo Kang. But as I said, it's analyzing this ideological aspect of AI is not the core of my talk tonight. With you, I would like to go straight to what I briefly mentioned, to the mathematical model that we find today. And we can take different routes, but today what we have at the core of machine learning in general as a technique of computation is the automation of statistical tools for multidimensional analysis of what we are called once multivariable analysis or factor analysis. And this technique to manipulate properties of multidimensional spaces have been used to do a lot of things, you know, from pattern recognition, image recognition, now to all this complex, sophisticated model for natural language processing that some of the contributors of this conference have already illustrated. Here, what we have on the left is just an attempt to visualize in a sort of geometrical way a space that is indeed impossible to imagine, or maybe possible to imagine, but difficult to visualize by human mind. And on the right, what usually mathematicians describe according to a multidimensional matrix. My question is indeed, how did we end up here? How did we end up to this kind of, in my opinion, pristine mathematical tool? I think Claire Zong, Jonathan Roberge, and Tom Lebrun already mentioned the complexity of these techniques when indeed they are applied specifically to language modeling. This afternoon they mentioned this indeed. But for me, what is interesting that we didn't arrive at this point, you know, of automation of statistical tool because, for instance, a mathematician proposed this, because a computer scientist had an illumination one day out of the blue. We arrived at this model of also computation through a long history of controversy, experiments, failures, misunderstandings, mathematical computation, prove and unproved theorems. And I'm interested in this history that I see as a history that is pretty spurious, not really linear, an example of the fact that human rationality has never been linear. But also I'm interested in unpacking the history behind this, because it's a history that for me is directly related to pressing questions like labor automation, automation of the management of labor, and automation of different kind of human skill and forms of labor. I think I don't have to go back to rewrite the history of artificial intelligence, but with you I would like indeed to lower our attention, so to speak, to open up the lower layer of the AI construction, and remember that the history of artificial intelligence in terms of a knowledge model has been indeed a history of controversy, but mostly a history in the last half a century, the history of a confrontation of two main paradigms, the symbolic AI and connectionism, the paradigm of artificial neural network. These two paradigms operate according to, as you know, to two different logic, a deductive logic for the original symbolic AI and an inductive logic for connectionism. Recently, Cardone and other scholars published an article that has illustrated very well also in terms of number of citations, circulation of papers, the confrontation of these two paradigms. And also they illustrated with some beautiful diagrams what are popularly known as the different winters or summers of artificial intelligence. This article is Neuron Spike Back, that was published on Réseau in 2018. And I think many of you are familiar this diagram. But for me, this is important to remember that AI is not this monotonic paradigm. Machine learning that did not emerge as a sort of self-proving argumentation, self-proving inference, but through different experiments and attempts. This distinction, this opposition between the paradigm of symbolic AI and the one of connection was already clear also in the past. I always mention this paper by the Dreyfus brother, Making a Mind versus Modeling the Brain, published in 1988, that already made clear, had clear words to describe the confrontation of these two knowledge models that constituted the history of artificial intelligence. And however, what is interesting for me is the fact that this is not a confrontation of mathematical ideas. There's been also a struggle in between devices or different way to design machines. I would like just to remember the fact that one interesting aspect in relation to the way we define intelligence, and for me it's very important that the current paradigm that we consider the hegemonic one, the one of machine learning or deep learning, originally was inspired not by the attempt to automate cognition, but to automate pattern recognition. And there is a sort of hegemony of the visual paradigm that is still run at the core of current machine learning that operate, in my opinion, as a cognitive fossil whose implications still have to be properly understood. It's interesting indeed also in the work of McCulloch and Pitts how their founding papers, the 1943 and the 1947, they were the papers in which the idea of artificial neural network or artificial neurons was proposed. There were papers in which these two paradigms, the one of deductive symbolic AI and the one of the inductive logic, they were still struggling to emerge. But of course, we know that is the other paradigm that has been more successful, and the good old symbolic artificial intelligence ended up in a kind of dead end because of issue of computational limit. So continuing and mentioning briefly this history, it would be interesting to look also at the dimension of the first experiment, like a Rosenblatt perceptron, that started this process through which we automated cognition through something different that is actually the recognition of visual patterns or pattern recognition. And I'm pretty intrigued by the dimension of Rosenblatt perceptron that was basically a statistical neural network with 400 pixel resolution for its retina, was like operating with 400 photoreceptors that were related to 400 dimensions to be computed by this very primitive and simple neural network. The history that followed the perceptron, we know, is the history of indeed the escalation of the parameters of this artificial neural network. But what is interesting for me is the fact that these artificial neural networks, in even the current form of deep learning, are experimental machine. And this is an important idea to understand what kind of knowledge model is today represented by AI. An experimental machine means that indeed we don't know how these devices exactly operate, and we lack a theory of proper operation for this device. It's like we are still in the age in which we have the steam engine, right? We operate the steam engines, but we don't have the discipline of thermodynamics to describe what are the laws according to which the steam engines operate. And indeed, today we say that, of course, we have machine learning and deep learning as sometimes efficient technique devices to do something like pattern recognition, but we lack a theory of statistical learning. And this is an important aspect. And this aspect of experimental machine was already somehow defended, discussed by Rosenblatt in an important paper for me from 1964, in which he defended this experimental dimension of artificial neural networks against what he defined as the Aristotelian method of symbolic AI. And he claimed that indeed artificial neural networks follow a sort of Galilean methods in the field of computation, while the other method being the Aristotelian one that is not really based on testing, but is only based on the faith that the human mind and the human language can clearly represent what happens in nature. Another aspect that I like to stress of this history of artificial neural network as experiment is also this dimension of paper machine, of the fact that these neural networks were often sketched on paper, and this relation with paper, with this relation with diagrams, the relation with the pen and pencil in an age before digital computer, for me is another important epistemic aspect in the history of AI. Here in this slide, I just drop an image of what the convolutional LeNet neural network looked like in 1989. You see there Yann LeCun with a very old PC running a quite okay form of character recognition with numbers. And also, I want to just mention this book by Paul Virilio that in 1988, however, somehow prophetically recognized a specific role to the perceptron when nobody else, very few other people were like, especially in media theory, being aware of this, already recognized this role of the perceptron in the automation of vision and the future of artificial intelligence. So my overview is just to, to sketch this complexity, to show the different problems or the different scale of, I would say, epistemic troubles that we find within the algorithm of machine learning that is impossible to summarize. Today, compared to the age of the perceptron, what we witness is an escalation of the number of parameters that run these algorithmic models. If you think, as I said before, the old simple perceptron by Rosenblatt had only 400 parameters. Today, you have these foundation models like the one developed by, NVIDIA, the last one that has 8 million parameters. And I think some of the speakers familiar with the GPT-3 can talk about in this complexity. What does it mean to have an escalating number of parameters? At the moment, I think the biggest model is TNLG by Microsoft that count 17 billion parameters. I mentioned this, and it's been already mentioned by other speakers, about the fact that the dimension of this model produce immediately issue of access, control of this technology. They are no longer simple or small neural networks somehow we could train, renting some space on a cloud, but already the dimension of these models poses question of privatization, of our knowledge, access, and monopoly. There are also other important aspects that are for instance, the fact that we should also mention and consider that somehow, I think these are also the years, 2021, 2022, the next year in which machine learning is reaching its epistemic limit, so to speak, in terms of computational resources. Has been discussed recently by some computer scientists, the fact that the error correction technique, including gradient descent, through which we control neural networks as other machine learning algorithms, cannot, provide any more that kind of efficient outcome unless, these companies are ready to pay an exorbitant expenses in terms of computational resources. And there are some people that already consider that the cost of error correction techniques for large models, like the one I try to discuss here, they're not even feasible for big companies. So I think that we are reaching a sort of epistemic limit for computational limit for these models that will evolve only if other maybe solution will be fine. But what is important for me and is discussed in the literature on foundation model is their strange hegemonic capacity to deal for the first time with data set of the most diverse form, of the most diverse origins. So this foundation model are said to be trained on that data set that are no longer homogeneous, that can contain, a mix of text, images, speech, structure or unstructured data, 3D signals, movies, and so on. And so this model have acquired a capacity to encode our cultural heritage in a pretty versatile way. And on the other hand, this model are used, or they are said will be used for trying to automate the most diverse task. And I took this slide here from this recent paper on the risk of foundation model published by the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. And they indeed claim that through these foundation models, they can automate complex tasks from question answering, sentiment analysis, information extraction of any sort, object recognition, instruction following, and so on. For me, what is interesting is that these models are a form of mechanization of our collective intelligence at the highest degree. They are probably one of the best example of what the political economy of the 19th century would call the mechanization of the general intellect. And indeed, they impose important issue for the digital humanities, but indeed for the role that these models and these data monopolies have in relation to our collective knowledge and cultural heritage. And this brings me to the most important aspect for me of the epistemic scaffolding of artificial intelligence, that is the role of labor, and especially the role of the automation of and control of labor in the history of artificial intelligence. This is an aspect that is not always properly covered, I would say, and is an important part of my research, especially for this book that I just finished for Verso, titled The Eye of the Master, that tried to show how indeed the history of machine intelligence and the history of artificial intelligence in general have been, directly related to industrial and partially also military drive to automate manual labor, to automate mental labor, and specifically to automate visual labor. I think it's important that in our reading of AI, we distinguish this different aspect, and also we keep an eye on also not just the automation of labor, but the automation of the management of labor. That is another issue. On the automation of manual labor, I think we have impressive literature, as we know. What is crucial for me is like an important political economist of the 19th century, like Charles Babbage, used his theory about the automation of manual labor to devise also the automation of mental labor as the basic idea at the core of his experiment of calculator that was the difference engine. The automation of mental labor for me has been, I would say, properly automated, embodied for the first time by the work of not of Turing, that was speculative, but the theory of information of Shannon, and the first material construction of the first digital computer, according, for instance, to the von Neumann architecture in the 50s. But I think to understand the importance or the epistemic dimension of today's machine learning and deep learning, we have to keep an eye on the automation of visual labor, an aspect that is often neglected. And the fact, as I mentioned before, that the perceptron and other classifier algorithms were born by imitating indeed the act of perception or the act of interpreting an image. It is quite a complex cognitive task. Today, these techniques are also used, interesting enough for me, not to automating specific individual tasks, but to automate the management of labor. So techniques of pattern recognition, data governance of any sort are used by Amazon and the different forms, the different companies of platform capitalism, not to automate indeed the work of single workers, but actually to organize them better, to organize their management, across complex ramification through metropolis, warehouses, and so on. And for me, it's interesting to map also the galaxy of terms and discipline of human resources that are becoming synonymous with machine learning and data analytics. And if we look indeed at the studies on the management of labor today, or what are the forms of data governance, big data analytics, we see a galaxy of terms, of disciplines, techniques that are pretty similar and overlapping. And that for me somehow show the role that the control of social behaviors and control of labor have in today's business of AI. And indeed, the notion like human resources, people analytics, social physics, pattern of life analysis used by notoriously the military, predicting policy algorithm and techniques used by the police, the psychography of Cambridge Analytica, the long established statistics discipline of psychometrics, and new technique of urban trajectology used by indeed the companies of the new platform capitalism. These, I think, are important technique that clarify which form of knowledge we are talking about when we talk about one of the important business of AI today. If I have still a few minutes or it, I would like maybe just to mention also what I promised to you in our email exchange a few days ago. That is the fact that I'm not here to give, you know, a sort of ontology of what artificial intelligence is today, but I would be interested in, you know, a collaborative research on the epistemic troubles, I call them like that. So I think that today this paradigm of intelligence that is AI is composed by different troubles that are affecting it. And I mentioned briefly this list, not because I want to conclude with a boring list, but because I think these are like important questions that remain unresolved in the debate on automated intelligence today. So as I said at the very beginning, one of the issues we have is this problem of anthropomorphization and naturalization of technology. And we play there at the level of ideology, and we have to consider this seriously. Then there is this unresolved still confrontation between the paradigm of symbolic AI based on deductive logic and the one of connection is based on inductive logic. And a lot of confusion within the computer science community, but also the critical AI studies field in between, you know, what is deductive, inductive, and abductive logic. And I think this is a very interesting issue to discuss further. Also, hopefully to clarify the confusion and the big misunderstanding we have in relation to these notions. Then another aspect that is part of the problematic dimension of AI is the fact that indeed the automation of cognition it is at the core of machine learning, emerged as the automation of pattern recognition. And this goes back to an important controversy that cyberneticians had with members of the Gestalt school back in the 30s, the so-called second Gestalt controversy. It was indeed about if the recognition of an image was an act of logical inference or not. And then, as I mentioned again, this issue of experimental machine, the state of experimental machine that artificial neural network and other algorithms maintain today. And the important problem that today mostly we operate with these techniques of multidimensional analysis. And then I could conclude indeed mentioning other issue, but for me, what is at stake, and I hope you can see still my slides. Rita, you still see my slides show, right?
Yes,
Good,
we
good,
do.
good. Yeah, no, I just want to close indeed. If you see it very well, it went off. I want to conclude going back to what is the mathematical model of machine learning today. And the fact that today we have to mobilize all our forces and discipline and studies, from critical AI studies to critical hermeneutics to history of science and technology to the history of labor and management to digital humanities, to understand this relation. That is the relation between this technique of vectorization and the automation of statistical tool of multidimensional analysis and our life, human language, labor, and social behaviors. And I think this is the problem that we have today discussing AI between the humanities and social sciences, how we are able to map the relation between this abstract mathematical tool that few understand what it's about, but at the end it's pretty intuitive. If we have like 2 hours to go through the history of statistic and multivariable analysis and things like that. And on the other, the way this technique is mapping, converting, coding our language, the way it's controlling labor, the way it's controlling social behaviors, and so on. And I think I would like to conclude here, indeed, looking at what I call the epistemic roots of machine learning that go back to our life, to our society, and our culture. And Orit, I would stop here. I mean, leaving the discussion for this big bridge we have to build between these two dimensions.
Thank you for that brilliant talk and really provocative. There's just so much I'm thinking about and so much to discuss. So thank you very much. I guess now we're going to turn to some discussion about this talk. I know I have a series of questions. Perhaps, I don't know what your protocol is, if you want people to put it in the chat or pose things to me. Anyway, so first, I just want to thank you, Matteo, for the incredible clarity and also putting forth just a very provocative. I already see our collaboration emerging. It's going to be on epistemic troubles, clearly. Of course, one of my big questions was what troubles for whom? Is it more our epistemologies that are being challenged? But is it the troubles of AI? How exactly is this happening? And that was very, very fascinating to me to ask, sort of like who's being troubled through the kind of questions that AI or the kind of provocations that you're putting forth. So that would be kind of something I'd love to talk about more with you. I also, so I don't know. So I also have to say that I really like the idea of also trouble being as productive. And I think that's something your work also gestures to. I'm particularly intrigued in questions of experimentation and how you're thinking about them in relationship to automation, and particularly about the idea that also this is also an opportunity, of course, to remake minds and machines. So I thought that was something very powerfully came through in your talk. But I'm actually seeing some questions already
If
emerging.
you want, I can react immediately to your counter questions, or we can open to more questions. But I like what you just said, Orit. You know, troubles for who? I think we have two dimensions. There are troubles coming from society, and I think a good way to define machine learning as in a very traditional way for political economy, and I discussed this also with my students, is basically as a gigantic, you know, fantastic endeavor, enterprise to predict and to preempt social conflicts. So, you know, as a fantastic construction, a brilliant mathematical sophistication to preempt and control, you know, social conflicts coming from any angle. So it's indeed, you know, this dialectical dimension, the troubles coming from the society. And the other troubles are troubles, I think, for us scholars, and the troubles that we have in between our discipline and the form of misunderstanding, miscommunication we have, and how our paradigm and our reading of AI indeed sometimes do not collaborate or interoperate well together. So I think we have troubles for everyone.
Well, that's a suggestive answer. As a historian, it also prompts for me this idea of the automation or perhaps erasure of the possibility of trouble also creates really interesting questions about whether there can be an event or say a crisis. Here I'm thinking kind of with the shock doctrine, like can we still have shocks in a system that operates like this? And what does that mean? Not only for historical consciousness, but also for political action around, and I know that that's come up in some of your previous work on trauma in neural nets. But I'm seeing questions, so let's I see Jonathan Roberge. Hi, Jonathan, how are you?
Hello, hi Orit, hi Matteo.
Hey.
Thanks a lot for your talk. I really like the way that you framed the political epistemology in between the logical aspect and the social aspect. But I was wondering if one of the missing link here is not about label and how we label the data sets. And that is also relating to this aspect of work that you mentioned. And on that, the work of Antonio Casilli in France is really important because he talks a lot about all of the small ends that goes into Mechanical Turk and goes into Facebook being able to recognize any kind of porn to problematic content. But this dimension of labeling is so bad in terms of epistemology because it's total chaos, so to speak. Yeah. So from that point of view, I think the labeling part is where you have this kind of disconnect in between the logic and the social, even though it's super important from an economical point of view. And when you go back on the other side of the economy, it's like not the little end, but like the management of human resources, you still find these labeling of emotion, for instance, in emotion recognition and stuff like that, where it's, again, totally half-baked as a technology. And so listening to you, I was like, maybe these labeling and labor is linked to some sort of beta capitalism of some sort.
Absolutely.
From an epistemological point of view is really kind of low key.
Jonathan, yeah, absolutely. And I think you introduced another of the epistemic troubles or epistemic dimension we have to clarify in taking seriously what are the specific form of this algorithm. So when we talk about the labor of classification, we're about to map, our human labor on something that is a classifier algorithm that goes back once again to the first experiment in automating pattern recognition. But these machines for automating pattern recognition based on neural network or not, they were pretty interesting because for the first time in the history of humanity, we had a machine that was supposed to automate a sophisticated gesture like the interpretation of an image, right? That if you talk to a scholar of visual arts or somebody from Bildwissenschaft in Germany would say, no, a machine would never be able to do that. And if you were even trying, for instance, in a thought experiment to explain to somebody from the 18th century that a machine could come one day to automate that kind of gesture, to recognize a pattern, to classify an object, would sound really science fiction. And I think this thing that is a sort of automation of the act of interpretation, what we can call, some call interpretation machines, right? Machine that automate this act, is something that is not properly explored, that is not properly covered by, critical epistemology of AI today or, critical hermeneutics. And there is this dimension of also labeling that is one of the form of the mental labor today. So also speaking of mental labor, we are stuck to two different paradigms that actually, I'm happy to mobilize all together. I'm not very sectarian. So mental labor of Babbage was the automation of hand calculation. And still the one of Shannon and Turing was quite an act of manipulation of symbols. But then other forms of this mental labor emerged that, are the labor of supervision, but specifically the one of, classifying an object or labeling, an object or preparing a data set is another big thing or big problem. Also because when, in the simple act of labeling a data set, and I think all the scholars have been working on different forms of ghost work today, Lily running on the Turkopticon project, they show how indeed when we do this simple gesture of labeling a data set, we mobilize unconscious taxonomy, spontaneous form of knowledge, these epistemic baggages that are not very clear what are they made of. So on that thing, there are a lot of things still to be said. Yeah, you just mentioned, I think, one of the many aspects that today, in my opinion, is under-investigated.
Are there any other questions in the audience?
There are a couple in the chat, I think.
Okay, I'm not, okay. I have a question for you from Hans-Gert Grabe, or a comment. Together with automation of manual and mental labor, the profession of an engineer emerged in the 20th century. What about the development of another profession, manager? Is the manager the upcoming engineer of the 21st century?
Yeah, seems like an interesting question, because probably computer engineers in the 1950s, they had clear plan for the automation of the automation of labor. If you think also the money coming from the U.S. Army for all this experiment to automate different tasks of supervision. But what is interesting for me today is the fact that against what was also a prophecy by Turing, right? Today, computers at the end are not automating the workers. I mean, I will mention this quote by Turing a bit later. But today, computers are mostly automating the masters. I mean, if you take the model that Turing had, of also the ACE, the computer he was trying to design in Manchester, he thought this computer, as a kind of computing machine in which workers, in his view, so sometimes he called also servants, were providing information, like data to be computed. And masters were like the engineers or the mathematician operating and inventing new programs to run the machine. And he thought that in the future, both human roles, both roles in front of this machine would be automated. Both masters and servants, in his expressions, would be automated. And one day this machine could operate by themselves. But what is interesting today in the general, in the international division of labor that we see today, also in the AI pipeline, in that today, the role of managers got automated while workers have been exponentially multiplied, and especially multiplied in terms of, what David Graeber defined as shit jobs, as these precarious and underpaid and very underdefined, unskilled jobs of operating, evaluating, and fixing a machine, and the large division of labor around, for instance, also machine learning models, what also Robert just mentioned, one of the shitty works of labeling data sets. So I think today we are in the strange situation that, looking at gig platforms, gig economy platforms, we have the automation of managers and not the one of workers. So the image of the anthropomorphic robot did not take place. If this is a question about the role of managers in today's forms of automation.
And it provokes an interesting historiographical question as well, since so much of management consulting, which in some sense was already the kind of start of automating management, came out of providing computer architectures for getting corporations kind of computerized. Whether we look at all the kind of big like BBM and the start kind of large scale management consulting firms. So this kind of effort to actually abstract and visualize and actually automate the management process of the corporation was kind of a post-World War II kind of obsession out of, I guess, operations research. So it provokes an interesting question, of course, then that I guess kind of, well, actually, before I keep going, I see Roxandra has a hand up.
Yeah, hello. So thank you so much for your talk for me as well. You have also mentioned the issue of anthropomorphization. And regarding this, I would like to ask you, what are your ideas on instigating a shift to post-anthropomorphic thinking, especially while thinking about intelligence, because we as humans are kind of trapped in the ways our bodies and minds allow us to view the world. So it could be argued that everything we have created, everything we explain, everything we think about is anthropomorphic.
Yeah, what I'm interested in is not the discussion on anthropomorphism or intelligence per se. I'm always interested in the historical condition in which this discourse takes place. And I really think that the work of Atanasowski Evora in the book Surrogate Humanity has been, really helpful to me, but helpful to anyone, because they show how anthropomorphism and the different discourse around even post-humanism, however, are strangely historically also well before the age of AI has been always instrumental to forms of invisibilization of labor. So even if you go back to the 19th century Victorian England and the cult of automata that you had there and all the discussion on non-human intelligence, whatever, you find an interesting relation with the condition of labor of that age. So I think indeed I'm not interested, as I said, in discussion of intelligence per se, or anthropomorphism per se, or animism. I'm only work on the relation of this notion in specific age and in specific economic contexts. So that's also would be one of the meaning of political epistemology, not epistemology per se, but epistemology is always grounded in a specific context. So I know that probably they don't answer your question, but I don't follow indeed, an interest in post-humanism per se. I'm interested in what are the real political stake behind that.
Or other thoughts? Well, I can just jump in if no one else has any questions for this super rich talk. The previous question about consulting also brought up questions of historiography and also your category of labor. So I was kind of both interested in sort of, there's these inheritances, these epistemic troubles that kind of have been lingering, and maybe these older histories of automation that you kind of lay out that sort of seem to reach their zenith maybe in AI, or probably not, but and then there's a question sort of about artificial intelligence's relationship to reformulation of political economy, and in here I'm kind of thinking again, like post 1970s, like what makes AI separate from other forms of automating cognition that you already identify, IQ tests, other forms of rationalizing intelligence that have already kind of emerged earlier. And also, how are we thinking about the disjuncture between this labor and the question that values increasingly being produced through financialization, for example, and crypto, through things that use a huge amount of computational power, but maybe are not vested in the same types of labor. So I was trying to think throughout your talks about how we might use these new epistemic concepts that you're throwing forward to begin to also account in certain ways for transformations in political economy. I don't know if that's like too big a question.
Yeah, it's very big, Orit, but I think we have to unpack it today, because I think we need to discuss in AI studies this political, economical dimension. I would skip the crypto side of the crypto dimension because
that's like, yeah.
what is interesting for me that these tools that we call tools for multivariable analysis. Now, these techniques of vectorization that we use today in natural language processing were like predated by the discipline of psychometrics, as you know. So the early century statistics and psychometrics in the collective program to measure the intelligence of society, the intelligence of children, the intelligence specifically of the soldiers of in the US Army. They invented this technique, very simple, you know, of factor analysis. Indeed, to measure cognitive tests, to assess cognitive tests like the notorious IQ test that was developed in the US, also on a mass scale for that reason. And what is interesting for me that then as now, this measurement of intelligence, the statistical measurement of intelligence were used to basically to organize the job market. So you were doing an IQ test, and then according to the result, you were assigned, or they were telling you that you are good as a mechanic, you know, working in a workshop, repairing car, or good as a white collar working in a bank. So they were instrumental to social hierarchies, together with instrumental to form of discrimination, for instance, between white and black communities and so on. And interestingly, I think also Wendy Chun in her last book, Discriminating Data, she's trying not to to go through this history of correlation technique from eugenics to the new forms of bias that are automated today in machine learning. And this is interesting. So this is the prehistory of the statistical tools, but today we see the same somehow problem at the core of machine learning in the new forms of automation of social, racial, and gender bias. So there is a lot of work to be done there. I think the last book by Wendy Chun is an attempt, to map this history of correlation techniques and their racial politics. But yeah, I think there are not enough works in this direction. I think we have discovered also the scholars of the humanities and social sciences are discovering this history of statistics through their encounter with AI and machine learning today. And we got a bit distracted, I would say, probably not just looking at the phenomenon of neural networks. We got distracted by the artificial neural network as a form of, computation. But at the end, digging, scratching the surface, we found at the core statistics. And we are still, I would say, updating our curriculum for a proper critical analysis of these techniques.
Yeah, I mean, you're highlighting a really critical point for future study, or something I think a lot about, but that your talk provoked. I was actually going to ask you about a particular moment where you actually sort of equated the erosion of causality with privatization. And I was sort of interested about whether in your formulation, uncertainty or a lack of need to kind of define risk or futures is somehow linked to this reorganization, if you will, not just of labor, but capital around this term of privatization. And that's kind of an ambiguous question, I understand, but one thing that I think is sort of problematic is sort of trying to understand whether 19th century, when we talk about epistemology, one question that also haunted me in this paper was, what kind of knowledge are we talking about? What forms of truth claims are coming out? What are the speech acts that follow? And here we're also thinking post-truth maybe, and the reactionary politics. So for me, there was a lot of questions about how the knowledge is changing, but then is it the same statistics if there's no longer a causal imperative, if you will, underpinning our ability to act on those numbers? How do we think both politically and economically about the uses and abuses of uncertainty as an actual underpinning technique, if you will, almost not just for calculation, but for speculation? And And also the kind of assumption you kind of made actually between the kind of erosion of causality in the times of truth claims and the kind of emergence of privatized or maybe decentralized, or maybe we'd call it self-organizing imaginaries or systems. I don't know if that was kind of clear, but there does seem to be some question about the continuity or the directness of the 19th century and early 20th century statistical thinking directly into our contemporary big data analytic driven. And you also gesture that because you talk a lot about transformations between induction, deduction, and abduction. So
I think already we need, proper new studies about the history of statistical thinkings. There is a tradition that has been working a lot on the history of mechanical thinking, right? From the modern age, stopping more or less at the time of cybernetics and early computation, when mechanical thinking became indeed electromechanical thinking and computation get automated. We have a history of statistical thinking as the one, provided by Jan Hacking and others, but we should basically extend that agenda, that research agenda, into today's machine learning that becomes something different from the statistical thinking of the 19th century. And indeed, what we have today in these large models that we just mentioned is form of brute force correlation. There's billions of parameters, they play the old correlation trick, but it's a quite brute force correlation that is also affecting the aesthetics that has been mentioned, I think, yesterday by Fabian Offord, and the aesthetics of GAN and the aesthetics of neural network in general. But it's this new brute force correlation, and about which indeed we don't have much of work done. I think if you hear some music, it's coming from another room from this apart. Let me know if there's too much environmental noise.
That adds to the experience. Creates a bit of chance that's not necessarily the automated and financialized type. Well, thank you for that provocative answer. And I know it's a big question, but something that really occupies me, at least. Are there any other questions or comments from the audience?
Or from Richard?
Well, sorry. Not specifically at this point. I'm still trying to process all the great points that have been brought up. But maybe someone else still wants to ask a comment.
I also don't know what time we are supposed to finish and declare the end of this conference. I'm talking for hours. I'm happy.
That's
me and Matteo like to talk, so we can just keep going. I want to hear more about how we're reconceiving statistical thinking. But if there isn't a whole lot of other conversations, then maybe we should bring it to an end. I know it's a great deal later in your time than in mine. I'm just, this is lunchtime for me, but evening for you. And I'm sure you all want your beer. It's Friday night or what have you. So thank you, Matteo, for a really provocative and excellent summary, and really an invitation to do a whole new, form of, I think, research on artificial intelligence with attention to epistemology, and to complicate actually the contemporary forms of genealogy we're doing. I think you're also gesturing that we need to think both more speculatively and perhaps more networked, if you will, into how we're approaching the histories of statistics and of intelligence that we're currently doing, as well as rethinking what models we're using, both how we understand models and what kind of models inhere within our own scholarships. So that's an excellent provocation and important demand. So thank you so much for that amazing talk. And thank you to the organizers for putting this together, and thanks for inviting me to even get to moderate. And have good night, I guess.
Yeah, thanks for it to you and to Richard and the others, and pity not being in Dresden altogether. Myself becoming a bit, I feel the fatigue of all these online conferences every week. So, but anyway,
yeah.
you, and it was a great event with a lot of ideas.